Something strange happened when reporters asked Caitlin Clark about the growing chaos inside the WNBA. Everyone expected fireworks. The league is sitting on one of the most intense labor standoffs in its history. Negotiations between players and team owners have been heating up for months, and rumors of a possible lockout have been floating around like a storm cloud over the entire season. So naturally, when the biggest star in the sport stepped up to the microphone, the media expected a strong statement. Support the union. Challenge the owners. Pick a side. But Clark did something completely different. Instead of delivering a bold speech or taking a clear stance, she calmly explained that she hasn't been part of every collective bargaining call. With more than 100 players involved, scheduling conflicts happen. Sometimes you just trust the representatives to handle the discussions. Simple. Neutral. Almost too neutral. At first glance, it sounded like a harmless answer. But within minutes, analysts, fans, and insiders started dissecting every word. Because in a moment when the entire league seems to be choosing sides, the most influential player in women's basketball essentially chose distance. No attack. No endorsement. No drama. Just a carefully worded response that kept her completely outside the center of the storm. And that's when people began asking a much bigger question. Was Caitlin Clark simply being honest? Or was this a calculated move to stay clear of a battle that could reshape the entire league? Because behind the scenes, the tension between the players and league leadership has been building for months. And if negotiations collapse, the consequences could shake the WNBA in ways no one is ready for. And the deeper you look into the situation, the clearer it becomes that Clark may have understood something the rest of the basketball world is only now starting to realize. To understand why that short answer from Caitlin Clark caused so much discussion, you have to look at the situation quietly unfolding behind the scenes of the WNBA. For months, tension has been building between team owners and the WNBA Players Association over the future of the league's next collective bargaining agreement. On the surface, it's a negotiation about salaries, revenue sharing, and long-term financial structure. But underneath that surface is something much bigger. A battle over how the rapidly growing league should divide the money now flowing into women's basketball. The stakes have never been higher. Television ratings have surged. Ticket sales are rising in multiple markets. Corporate sponsors are paying attention in ways they never did before. And much of that momentum can be traced directly to one name, Caitlin Clark. Clark's arrival didn't just boost a few numbers, it completely shifted the conversation around the league. Games featuring her team began drawing dramatically larger audiences. Arenas started selling out weeks in advance. Jerseys, merchandise, and social media engagement exploded almost overnight. Suddenly, the WNBA wasn't just growing. It was becoming one of the most talked about stories in professional sports. And when money begins to grow that quickly, negotiations always get complicated. Veteran players across the league have been pushing aggressively for a larger share of the league's expanding revenue. Many believe the current financial structure no longer reflects the value players bring to the game. Some have openly argued that the next agreement must dramatically increase salaries and benefits, especially with new media deals and sponsorship money entering the picture. But league ownership sees the situation differently. From the owner's perspective, the league is still in a delicate growth phase. While viewership has increased, many teams are still operating carefully to maintain financial stability. Owners want to expand the league, build infrastructure, and secure long-term media deals before committing to massive salary increases. That difference in perspective has created a growing divide between both sides. And lately, insiders have been whispering about a possibility no one wants to see: a potential lockout if negotiations completely break down. Nothing has been officially announced, but the mere suggestion of it has already started sending shockwaves through sports media. Because if the season were suddenly disrupted, it wouldn't just impact contracts or negotiations. It could slow down the incredible momentum women's basketball is finally experiencing. And right in the center of that fragile moment stands the one player everyone is watching, whether she wants that spotlight or not. By the time Caitlin Clark stepped onto a WNBA court for the first time, something unusual had already started happening around the league. Fans who had never followed women's basketball were suddenly watching games. Television networks were adjusting their schedules to feature more broadcasts. Entire arenas were selling out days, sometimes weeks, in advance. What had once been a steady but modest sports league was now experiencing a surge of attention that felt almost impossible to ignore. It didn't take long for analysts to recognize what was happening. Clark wasn't just another talented rookie entering the league. She had arrived with a level of popularity that women's basketball had rarely seen before. Her long-range shooting, confident style of play, and record-breaking college career had already built a massive fan base, and those fans followed her straight into the professional game. The impact showed up everywhere. Games featuring Clark often drew dramatically higher television ratings compared to typical league broadcasts. Social media clips of her deep three-pointers and fast-paced play began circulating far beyond the usual basketball audience. Even casual sports fans who rarely watched the WNBA suddenly knew her name. And with that surge of attention came something every professional league ultimately depends on: money. Sponsors began leaning in. Broadcast partners started paying closer attention. Merchandising numbers climbed. The league's visibility expanded in ways that many executives had been hoping for years to achieve. In many ways, Clark's presence accelerated the league's growth timeline almost overnight. But rapid growth can also create pressure. When a league suddenly attracts new audiences and new revenue opportunities, everyone involved starts thinking about how that success should be shared. Players see their value increasing. Owners look at long-term investments. Media companies analyze future rights deals. Every decision suddenly carries higher financial stakes. That's exactly why the current negotiations have become so intense. Because while the entire league is benefiting from this surge of interest, the question nobody can fully agree on is simple: how should the rewards be divided? And that's what makes Clark's position so unusual. On one hand, she's the biggest reason new attention is pouring into the league. On the other hand, she's still a young player navigating her first years as a professional while the entire business side of the sport shifts around her. Which means every word she says publicly now carries far more weight than it normally would. And that's exactly why her calm, almost distant response to the labor negotiations made so many people stop and think. Because sometimes the most powerful move in a complicated situation is choosing not to step into the fight at all. When Caitlin Clark answered that question about the collective bargaining discussions, most casual viewers probably heard nothing unusual. It sounded like a polite response from a young athlete trying to respect both sides of a complicated situation. But inside the world of professional sports, statements like that are rarely accidental. Every word spoken in front of cameras can ripple across sponsorship deals, media narratives, and even league politics. And that's why some analysts immediately saw something else happening. By explaining that she hadn't been part of every CBA call and that she trusted the representatives handling the negotiations, Clark essentially created a layer of distance between herself and the conflict. She didn't criticize the players' union. She didn't defend the owners. She simply acknowledged the process and stepped slightly to the side of the argument. For most players, that might not seem like a big deal. But Clark isn't just another player anymore. She's one of the most recognizable athletes in the entire sport, and with that recognition comes a completely different level of pressure. Major endorsement partners are watching her closely. Television networks see her as a key figure driving viewership. Sponsors want stability around the athletes they invest in. When someone reaches that level of visibility, every public statement can influence business relationships far beyond the basketball court. That's why many high-profile athletes learn early in their careers that sometimes the smartest move isn't choosing a side. It's choosing careful neutrality. Clark's answer did exactly that. She acknowledged that negotiations exist, but she didn't position herself as a spokesperson for either camp. She showed trust in the system without attaching her personal brand to the outcome of a negotiation that could become messy in the months ahead. And if tensions inside the league continue to rise, that decision could end up being extremely important. Because once labor disputes escalate, emotions tend to take over. Statements get amplified. Headlines become more dramatic. Suddenly, a single comment can turn into a national debate. Clark avoided that trap entirely. Instead of becoming the face of the conflict, she quietly shifted the attention somewhere else, toward her development as a player and the opportunities that exist beyond the league itself. And that's where the story starts getting even more interesting. Because while the WNBA debates contracts and revenue structures, Clark has been preparing for something much bigger than a single league season. While the league debates its future behind closed doors, Caitlin Clark has quietly been preparing for opportunities that stretch far beyond one domestic season. For many athletes, the WNBA represents the highest level of competition available. But Clark's rise has placed her in a much different position, one where the basketball world suddenly feels a lot bigger. International basketball has always been an important stage for elite players, but for someone with Clark's popularity, it carries an entirely different level of exposure. Representing Team USA means competing in front of global audiences, international broadcasters, and sponsors who are watching the growth of women's basketball with increasing interest. And that kind of global visibility changes the equation. If tensions inside the WNBA ever reach a breaking point, most players would face a difficult reality. Their primary stage would disappear overnight. Their visibility would drop. Their ability to build their personal brands would slow down dramatically. Clark, however, sits in a unique position. Her popularity isn't limited to one league or one market. Fans follow her highlights across social media platforms worldwide. Sports networks talk about her performances far beyond the usual WNBA coverage. Even casual basketball fans who rarely watch women's games recognize her name and her signature deep-range shooting. That kind of attention creates options. International tournaments, national team appearances, and global events all provide platforms where the spotlight can remain just as bright. For a player with Clark's growing influence, the basketball world doesn't shrink if one league faces challenges. It simply expands in other directions. And while the business side of the sport continues its complicated negotiations, Clark seems to be focusing on something much simpler: becoming a better player. The quiet months away from the spotlight weren't spent debating contracts or commenting on negotiations. They were spent in training gyms, practice courts, and conditioning sessions designed to prepare her for the next stage of her career. And the details starting to emerge about that preparation suggest something that should probably make the rest of the league a little nervous. By the way, if you enjoy deep breakdowns of the real stories shaping basketball, the strategy, the behind-the-scenes decisions, and the moments most fans miss, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Because what Clark has reportedly been working on during the offseason might explain why so many people around the league are watching her next move very carefully. After the whirlwind of her rookie season finally slowed down, something interesting happened. Caitlin Clark almost disappeared from the public spotlight for a while. There were no constant interviews, no dramatic headlines, and far fewer social media moments than people were used to seeing. For a player who had been at the center of the basketball world for months, the quiet stretch caught a lot of people off guard. But inside elite sports, silence like that usually means one thing: work is happening. Clark's first professional season was historic, but it was also exhausting. She went from the pressure of a deep college run straight into the physical grind of the WNBA schedule without much time to reset. Opposing defenses targeted her every night. Veteran players played her physically. Travel, media attention, and non-stop games pushed her body harder than it had ever been pushed before. Even with that constant pressure, she still managed to produce incredible moments. But athletes at the highest level are never satisfied with simply surviving a season. They want to come back stronger. That's exactly what Clark appears to have spent her off-season doing. Reports from training environments suggest she focused heavily on rebuilding her body, strengthening her core, improving endurance, and refining the mechanics that make her shooting range so dangerous. Conditioning became a priority, especially after a season where fatigue sometimes became visible late in games. But one detail about her training has drawn particular attention. Clark mentioned spending time playing high-intensity pickup games and full-court scrimmages, often against faster and more physical competition. For elite players, environments like that force rapid decision-making. Passing lanes close faster. Defenders move quicker. Every possession requires sharper reactions. Training in those conditions can make the pace of a normal professional game feel completely different. When players repeatedly practice in faster, more demanding situations, their instincts begin adjusting to that speed. Reads happen quicker. Ball handling becomes tighter. Shooting decisions become more automatic. And if that kind of development actually carries over into the next season, it could make Clark even harder to defend than she already was. which is exactly why so many people around the league are paying close attention. Because while the business side of the sport debates contracts and negotiations, Clark seems to be approaching the next season with a very different focus, improving every part of her game quietly, away from the noise. And if those improvements show up once the season begins, the impact might be impossible to ignore. As the next chapter of the WNBA approaches, one thing has become clear. The entire basketball world is watching what Caitlin Clark does next. Not just fans, but league executives, sponsors, broadcasters, and players across the sport. Because when someone changes the momentum of a league the way Clark has, every decision suddenly carries enormous weight. The negotiations surrounding the WNBA Players Association will eventually reach a turning point. Agreements will be signed, compromises will be made, and the business side of the league will move forward one way or another. Labor disputes are part of every major sport, and history shows they eventually resolve themselves. But what makes this moment different is the timing. The league is growing faster than it has in years. New fans are discovering women's basketball every week. Television networks are paying closer attention. Corporate sponsors are exploring long-term partnerships. For the first time in a long time, the future of the WNBA feels wide open. And right in the middle of that moment stands Caitlin Clark, a player whose presence alone has already reshaped the conversation around the league. What makes her approach so interesting is that she hasn't tried to control the narrative. She hasn't stepped into the middle of every debate. Instead, she's focused on improving her game, preparing for the next season, and letting her performance speak louder than any public statement ever could. Sometimes the most powerful move in sports isn't making the loudest comment or leading the biggest argument. Sometimes it's staying focused while everything around you becomes chaotic. And that's exactly what Clark seems to be doing. If the next season begins smoothly, fans will be watching to see how much her game has evolved after months of intense training. If the league faces more turbulence, people will be watching to see how the sport's biggest star navigates the pressure that comes with that spotlight. Either way, the next chapter of women's basketball is approaching quickly, and Clark is going to be right at the center of it. Now I want to hear your perspective. Do you think Caitlin Clark made the smart move by staying neutral during the labor tensions? Or should the league's biggest star take a stronger stance when issues like this appear? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below. This is one of the most interesting moments the league has faced in years. And if you enjoy breakdowns that go beyond the headlines and explore the real stories shaping the basketball world, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive.